Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany and some of its Axis allies during World War II. It started on June 22, 1941. It was the largest military invasion in human history, with more than 3 million men attacking along an 1,800-mile front. The code name was a tribute to Frederick I, a German king and Holy Roman Emperor who had led a crusade to the east in the 12th century.
The little dog is my little Gus. He passed away about a year ago. Loved him dearly. He sat at my feet for years while I researched and wrote my books. And his full name, it was the Baron von Gussie Vassalini, aka Gus, a cute little guy, as you could see. So that's Gus. I'm going to discuss in some detail the operations of the Luftwaffe on the 22nd of June, 1941, the first day of Operation Barbarossa, when the Luftwaffe had a really big day. And I'm going to precede that with a discussion of the aircraft involved, the Luftwaffe's order of battle, its various mission assignments, doctrine, and so forth. So we'll touch on a lot of areas. And my account is based on both secondary and primary source materials, including a number of Luftwaffe records, mostly derived from the collection at the Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. That's the home to what they call the Karlsruhe Document Collection. And it's a series of reports prepared by Luftwaffe agencies during the war or by former Luftwaffe officers in the 1950s under the supervision of the United States Air Force. And much of the material in this discussion is gleaned from my books, Barbarossa Unleashed, The German Blitzkrieg Through Central Russia to the Gates of Moscow, which that's almost hard to believe, but in May it will be 10 years since that book came out. And then The First Day on the Eastern Front, Germany Attacks the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, which of course I have some nice chapters in that book on dealing with just air operations. And that book came out a few years back. And then the book that I did with David Stahel, Soldiers of Barbarossa, Combat, Genocide, and Everyday Experiences on the Eastern Front, June to December 1941. And the remainder of the material is derived from my library, research notebooks, and so forth. So let me get started here. And some of this stuff is pulled directly from those sources, and then some of my comments will, of course, be extemporaneous, depending upon what comes to mind. So, at last, a proper war, remarked Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Hans Janicek shortly before the start of the Eastern Campaign. After the bitter failure of aerial operations over Great Britain, the Luftwaffe general was no doubt anticipating with some relief the impending war in the East, where his air forces could once again return to their primary mission of providing air support to German ground forces and, thus, help to replicate the stunning victories in the West of the previous year. Yet despite Janisek's observation, a student of German air operations between September 1939 and the spring of 1941 might easily conclude that the Luftwaffe had indeed been fighting a, quote, proper war, unquote, all along. Certainly in the sense that it had been engaged, from the very beginning in costly and continuous combat for the entire 21-month period leading up to Barbarossa in June of 1941, and in the process sustaining serious losses in both aircraft and air crew, while the Army, on the other hand, had suffered much smaller proportion, sacrificed a much smaller proportion of its forces and experienced a relative hiatus in the fighting between July 1940 and April 1941 when the Balkan campaign began, which of course only lasted a few weeks. So let me talk a little bit about some of these first slides. As I mentioned, of course, there was very high attrition in the first 19 months. In Poland, believe it or not, the Germans lost almost 20% of the aircraft that they had committed to that campaign, as you can see on the slide. And in the 1940 against France and the Low Countries, over 1,100 aircraft lost. And then between May and September 1940, the height of the Battle of Britain, the losses of the German Air Force amounted to some 3,000 aircraft, or literally more than half of its entire inventory. Now let's look at the force structure of the Luftwaffe. Right at the start of the French campaign on the 5th of May, the French campaign began on the 10th of May, I think. You can see I'm not going to waste people's time reading the numbers. You can see what the numbers were of different kinds of aircraft, and a total of just under 4,800 planes. Now,
hey, Craig, can I just interrupt?
yeah.
I don't know how you want to do questions here, but those losses on the previous slide, is that like usual? Most of those are accidents, weather, that kind of stuff, other than combat.
I don't know how many were combat and how many were accidents. I know, for example, the BF 109 had a very weak undercarriage, and it had a lot of accidents. Landing on just these runways in just which were set up in fields. If they had a rough landing, it could take out the landing gear. Of course, those planes could be salvaged. You might mess up the propeller as well. But yeah, in those days, as you know, the losses in the number of planes due to accidents was just unbelievable. And I can even recall when I was at Edwards Air Force Base and reading the history of the training activities that went on there with our B-24s primarily, and I think P-38s as well, but we did training on a lot of B-24s. And I swear, I don't remember if they had a crew of 8 or 10, but every week you had planes going down, people being killed, and just the training exercises. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of them were lost in training.
So,
but you can
sorry,
see here.
the question is pilots' losses versus, because pilots are harder to replace than airplanes.
Yeah, than the planes, of course, yes.
We know that. I mean,
yeah. And then you see here on the 21st of June, a little more than a year later, and look at the total number of aircraft. It's hardly changed. It's like 100 more. But notice here, whereas they had 1,711 bombers in May of 1940, they had 200 fewer just before the start of Operation Barbarossa, in a campaign along a front that was was so much larger than anything the Germans had attempted before. And the losses of the Luftwaffe were essentially unsustainable, but they would, of course, be much greater in the Russian campaign. And I point out here, the distance from the Franco-German border to Paris was 300 kilometers. But from the Russo-German frontier to Moscow, you're talking of almost exactly a 1,000 kilometers. And then you see the 4 air fleets that were assigned to Barbarossa. We're really only going to talk about 3 of them. One of them, I think it was the 5th Air Fleet, was up with the Army of Norway in the north. And here you see it had a total of about 3,500 aircraft that were assigned to Operation Barbarossa, but only 2,250 of them were fully mission capable on the 22nd of June. And then, of course, you'll see Hitler's secret weapon I have there when I just had to throw that in there for make sure everybody's paying attention. So, okay. So, despite the fact that we're talking about a number of aircraft, operational aircraft, just a little over 2,200 for a front that extended 1,800 kilometers. And then because the front was shaped like a funnel, it only got broader as the campaign went on. So the force structure, similar to the force structure on the ground, was just hopelessly inadequate for the unprecedented scope of the mission. And as the air power historian James Coram has observed, sort of buttressing my point here, in Russia, it was a case of too much front and too few aircraft. Although the Luftwaffe performed brilliantly, as it did, in the early stages of the campaign, it simply lacks sufficient numbers to carry out its various missions. And we will get into that in a minute. Yet, despite its modest numbers and already substantial losses, the Luftwaffe of 1941, it was still quite a formidable force, as we will see. And then, as Coram, in his biography of Wolfram von Richthofen, as he wrote in that biography, by any measure, the Luftwaffe was superior to its enemies in 39 to 41. The Bf-109 fighter was superior to most opponents, and only Britain's Spitfire could match it in combat. The Ju-88, Heinkel 111, and Do-17 medium bombers were some of the best machines of their day. In Poland, Norway, France, North Africa, and Russia, the Ju-87 Stuka had proved to be fearsomely effective as a close support aircraft. In addition to these combat machines, the Luftwaffe could field 500 transport planes, the largest air transport force in the world, and one that played a decisive role in several earlier campaigns. Now, just very briefly to talk about a few of the aircraft types. The Messerschmitt, there you go. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, of course, was a single-seat, single-engine fighter. And at its inception, it was probably the best fighter in the world. But by 1941, it was most likely outclassed by the British Spitfire. Now, the Bf-109E, or the Emil, was the first Bf-109 to be produced in large numbers, and it had replaced earlier series or iterations of the aircraft in first-line combat squadrons by the autumn of 1949. It was followed in late 1940 by the introduction of the Bf-109F, or the Friedrich. And the Friedrich was outfitted with a somewhat more powerful engine. It had a top speed about 30 miles miles per hour more, about 390 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. And excuse me. And it was intended for precision shooting, and it featured a nose-mounted 15 millimeter or 20 millimeter cannon and two 7.92 millimeter machine guns. Now, in Russia, most of the Messerschmitt fighters were the F model, but the E models were generally outfitted with bomb racks to perform as fighter bombers as well. And they employed a new weapon which marked a significant increase in the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. And this was the SD-2 fragmentation bomb. I think that stood for Sprengbombe Dichtwande, meaning explosive bomb with like a thicker shell. And it was literally the first true cluster bomb, and it was far more lethal than conventional munitions when used to attack ground troops or vehicles in the open. It was like a big canister that would open up and release dozens of these little 2-pound bomblets over a large area. And it was quite effective. It was so effective, in fact, that the U.S. Air Force copied it and produced it after the war, and it remained a standard munition in the U.S. Air Force into the 1960s. Now, I'm trying to go through these kind of quickly and just hitting some highlights. The Heinkel 111, and if God invented an airplane, that would have been it. This aircraft is just exquisitely what am I trying to say? Has just exquisite looks, and it was a beautifully handling aircraft. It was aerodynamically very efficient, with, as you can see, this elliptical wing and completely glazed and streamlined fuselage nose. It was one of the most outstanding airplanes of the mid-1930s, and therein lies the problem. By the time the Battle of Britain came around, and certainly Barbarossa, it was already approaching obsolescence. And it had fought with the Condor Legion in the Spanish Civil War, and by September 39, some 2/3 of Luftwaffe bomber units were outfitted with the Heinkel 111, and it would remain the backbone of the German horizontal bomber fleet throughout the war. Now, it could absorb absolutely massive amount of punishment and still make it back to its base, but it was simply too light to conduct any kind of serious strategic bombing. It only had a bomb load capacity of about 4,000 pounds. And by comparison, the Ju-88, which I'm not going to really talk about here, was actually a better aircraft by this time and could carry a somewhat larger bomb load. Now, according to Luftwaffe historian Horst Boog, the German bomber wings, or Kampfgeschwader, in the Barbarossa order of battle were equipped with 757 fully operational bombers on the 21st of June. Again, the majority being the Heinkel 111. And now the Stuka, the Ju-87, and in the Russia campaign, the B model, I think almost all of them were B models, and that I think was the first major production series of the aircraft. And what do I have here on that? Oh, despite its slow speed and light armament, which made it vulnerable to small arms fire, I have an account. I'm not going to read it here because it's too long, of one Ju-87 pilot who survived the war was shot. He was shot down 13 times. It wasn't Hans Rudel, it was someone else, but he was shot down 13 times and managed to survive each of those. In Poland and France, the Stuka had really showcased its ability to accomplish both the CAS, the close air support, and the interdiction mission. And in a couple of my books, I have accounts by not just the individual I mentioned, but also by Hans Rudel, and there's also an account from the French campaign by the French historian Marc Bloch, who, if I recall, ended up in a German concentration camp, and while he was imprisoned, wrote an entire history of Europe, I believe, without having a single note or document to do it with. But he, it might have, I can't remember the book it was in. He wrote an account of being on the receiving end of a attack by a group of Stuka dive bombers, and with the horns of Jericho that they emitted as it went into its dive. He said it was literally just so unbelievably terrifying and frightening. I looked and looked to try and find his account because it was really quite graphic, but I was unable to find it. So anyway, he certainly corroborates what a lot of other people found out on the receiving end of the Stuka. Now, in an era before precision-guided munitions, the Ju-87, it was really a highly accurate bomber, able to strike its target in diving at an angle of maybe up to about 70 degrees with an accuracy of less than 30 yards. Keep in mind, our B-17s over Europe, I think they had a circular error probability of something like 5 miles. And they were bombing from, well, of course, they were bombing from 24,000 feet or something, meaning that half their bombs would fall within that circle and half of them would fall outside that 5 mile circle. The aircraft was outfitted with special speed brakes, which would reduce the speed in a steep dive from about 650 to 450 kilometers an hour, which made aiming easier. But here's the interesting thing. The pilots soon concluded that their attacks came off better when they did not use the speed brakes, which were not only cumbersome to operate, but slowing down the duration of the dive. It would necessarily increase the time over target, and therefore the two-man crew's vulnerability to fire from the ground. Now, the Stuka got beat up, just be very quick here on this, it got beat up pretty badly in the Battle of Britain because it was just too slow to compete in that environment, and given its lack of defensive armament. On the Russian front, however, operating in 1941 in an environment of often near total air superiority, it performed to great effect. And all told, the Luftwaffe force structure in the East included came to a total of 360 aircraft. Not, again, just another example of how underpowered Operation Barbarossa was, because for the whole front, 360 aircraft was not much. Now, 323 of these aircraft were all assembled with Army Group Center, and the remainder, 37, whatever it was, were up, I think, with the 5th Air Fleet in the north. And they were all Ju-87Bs. And their mission essentially or what they accomplished, certainly on Barbarossa Tag, and then in all the days after, their mission was to strike a broad array of targets, including bridges, buildings, field fortification, trains, railroad lines, railroad installations, and of course, concentrations of troops, tanks, artillery. And then they also furnished close air support for the armored formations that were, of course, signified the tip of the spear of the German attack. And final thing I'll say here about the Stuka is the mission profile, as I went into a little bit, was quite demanding. The pilot, for example, was subjected to G pressures of 4 to 12 Gs for just a period of 1 to 6 seconds, depending on how he leveled out from his dive. And as one Stuka trainer said, quote, a dive speed of 480 kilometers per hour placed enormous strain on the system. The pressure while leveling out was so intense that pilots occasionally experienced a temporary misting sensation that could last a few seconds, which of course meant that for a few moments, the pilot blacked out. In addition, the infernal scream emitted by the dive bomber's Jericho trumpet siren could literally shatter an eardrum. And in my book, Barbarossa Unleashed, I have a long discussion of a Luftwaffe pilot, of a Stuka pilot who survived the war. And these people, what these men went through, these Stuka crews went through, was just unbelievable. On Barbarossa Tag alone, they conducted anywhere from 4, 5, 6, even as many as 8 individual missions on the 22nd of June. They kept that pace up for months without surcease, without respite. Some of them literally, I don't know how many it was, but some of them literally cracked under the pressure and ended up being institutionalized. And this one pilot, I think his name was Voigt, I have his whole discussion in the book. He talks about how he was coming back for a mission, just landing from a mission, and God knows how many missions he'd flown that day or over the last previous weeks or months. And the mechanic comes up and says, "Here's your new plane, sir. Get on it and go." He cold cocked him. He just smashed him in the face and knocked him on the ground. And he said, if that crewman had had a gun, I would have been dead. And for some reason, the whole thing was just, it blew over and no big deal was made about it. But that just gives you some idea of what these men went through. And I should add that the fighter and bomber crews, or pilots and crews, also flew multiple missions on the 22nd of June and in the days that followed. Now, a little bit, goes down to my slides 9 and 10, I think, a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses and a little bit about the basic doctrine of the Luftwaffe. Okay. In addition to possessing aircraft types generally superior to those of the Soviets, their VVS, and don't ask me to try to say that, Luftwaffe air crews were also far better trained, as we all know, and enjoyed a significant edge, obviously, in experience. The command organization and doctrine of the German Air Force allowed for greater flexibility, meaning that air power could be shifted rapidly between different sectors of the front. In addition, an effective signal network facilitated command and control of deployed air units, and enabling Luftwaffe commanders to concentrate their assets at decisive points along the battlefield. These and other attributes of the German Air Force in 1941 would enable it to virtually sweep the Soviet Air Force from the skies in the opening days of the campaign. Conversely, in matters of logistics, here we're talking about fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and so forth, the Luftwaffe possessed some severe, if concealed, weaknesses. But no matter, the thinking was that Barbarossa, which was going to be the first true blitzkrieg, would be over in 8 to 10 weeks. So whatever shortcomings they had, the Luftwaffe had, did not appear to be particularly troublesome. Now, the primary task of the Luftwaffe in Russia was to furnish the ground forces, and in particular, the mobile units upon whose success the outcome of the campaign largely hinged, with direct and indirect support. Now, direct support, that was the close air support mission, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. And that means attacking enemy forces at or near the friendly main line of battle. Indirect support, of course, embraced the interdiction of troop concentrations, roads, bridges, rail lines, supply depots, and other assets of some value to the enemy. Now, Luftwaffe field commanders were accustomed to cooperating closely with ground units, and in large part, they accepted their support role. And this was an attitude that was exemplified by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded the second Luftflotte, or the second air fleet, which operated in support of Army Group Center during the summer of 1941. And in his memoirs, he points out that he says, and I quote here, "All the same, the caption of this chapter is exemplary cooperation between Army and Luftwaffe. Relying on this harmony, I instructed my air forces and flak generals to consider the wishes of the Army as my orders without prejudice to their subordination to me." And then he goes on to say, unless serious air interests made compliance seem impractical or detrimental. So they took great pride in their supporting role for the Army. And that goes back to my very beginning when Hans Jesenek, the commander of the chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, says, at last, a proper war in Russia, meaning a war where the Luftwaffe's mission will largely be to support the forces on the ground. Now, the close air support mission was something that was, the Germans had one air corps that had practiced this. This was a part of their doctrine, and they were more advanced in the close air support mission than probably any other air unit in the world at this point. And that was von Richthofen's 8th Air Corps, which fought on the left wing of Army Group Center as part of Kesselring's 2nd Air Fleet. In 1941, the mission of indirect support, interdiction, was better understood and more readily carried out than the true CAS mission. Yet, although German air-ground coordination was still then in its infancy, major strides had been made in the application of close air support. When Barbarossa began, however, and this sort of buttresses what I was saying, only one air corps was specifically trained and equipped to conduct CAS, a capability for which the Luftwaffe as a whole remained ill-prepared. And this, was, of course, was Richthofen's 8th Air Corps. One of the outstanding tactical air commanders of World War II, Richthofen had fought with the Legion Condor in Spain, first as chief of staff, then as its field commander. And it was here in the Spanish Civil War that he had taken the first tentative steps toward developing a true CAS capability. In Poland in 1939, Richthofen led the newly created Close Support Air Corps, which by early October 1939 was renamed the 8th Air Corps. In May 1940, he led his 8th Air Corps and his fleet of Stuka dive bombers in the campaign in the West, for which he garnered the Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross. A brilliant tactical innovator, Richthofen applied himself between the French and Russian campaigns, while also leading his Air Corps in the Balkan offensive, to refining the Luftwaffe's close air support techniques. And just so I don't forget these photos, you can see him on the left-hand side with the stogie in his mouth. And then this what was something that seemed to be the middle photograph. It seemed to be a pastime of many German soldiers on the Eastern Front, because I've seen a number of soldiers like this. He's fishing with hand grenades. So that's what the central photo is there. So where was I? Okay, by June of 1941, he had perfected a system with which he had experimented since 1939, that of directing close air support from the ground using Luftwaffe liaisons in armored vehicles with appropriate radio sets to control the action. When the attack on Russia began, Luftwaffe airmen operating directly from the front lines were thus able to direct Luftwaffe attacks on fortified enemy positions. And I know Marco Rubio did this in a debate once, for which he was endlessly skewered, but I'm going to take a little drink here for a sec. Okay. The special CAS teams were assigned to the Panzer divisions were enormously effective in identifying the most valuable ground targets, while also helping to reduce friendly fire incidents. Now, as Richthofen's biographer Coram observed, quote, von Richthofen's 1941 innovations made the Luftwaffe much more effective in supporting the German ground forces. It would be 2 years before the British and Americans could field similar teams to coordinate their air support for the ground armies, end quote. And then, of course, I pointed out that Richthofen's 8th Air Corps was on the left wing of Army Group Center, principally supporting Hoth's, General Oberst Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group. I believe on the 8th, Richthofen had a total of, if I recall correctly, 5 of the Stuka wings, and the 2nd Air Corps, which was on the right flank supporting Guderian's 2 Panzer Group, I believe had 3 Stuka Air Corps. They're like a total of 8 for the 323 aircraft. Now, just very briefly, I want to just talk a little bit about the Luftwaffe and strategic air power, because my discussion to this point probably left the impression behind that German air power doctrine was conceived within the Luftwaffe as little more. The doctrine stipulated that the Luftwaffe was to be little more than just a support arm of the army, but nothing really could be further from the truth. German war doctrine, as Richard Mueller opined in his impressive work, The German Air War in Russia, as it evolved, in the mid and late 30s was, quote, as ambitious and far reaching as any developed during this heyday of air power prophesizing, end quote. Luftwaffe theorists developed a concept that they called operativer Luftkrieg, or operational air warfare, which was an attempt to integrate an independent air force into the conduct of modern total war. In other words, what I'm really saying is similar to U.S. air power planners at the Army, at the Air Corps Tactical School down at Maxwell Field in Alabama. The Germans in the pre-war period also strove to develop some meaningful theories on the strategic application of air power. And we don't really have time to go into this, but I will point out the first two prototypes that they developed in the 30s under the direction of General Weber, who unfortunately was killed shortly thereafter in an aerial accident, in an aircraft accident. They had come up with a couple of prototypes. Dornier had the DO-19, Junkers had the Ju-89, but neither of these airframes evinced acceptable performance. And both were, to put it simply put, they were underpowered, unwieldy machines. They never saw active service. Eventually, Heinkel came up with the HE-177, which actually did go into production and actually saw service, particularly in 43 and 44 on the Eastern Front, in some numbers where the Germans actually did try and develop some sort of strategic air campaign. Of course, it was pitiful compared to what we were doing, what the Anglo-American air forces were doing by that point. And one of the biggest problems the Germans had, I mean, they produced some tremendous aircraft that had tremendous capabilities, but they just had, it was a problem that plagued their development of heavy aircraft throughout the war. They just could not develop engines that were powerful enough to really make these aircraft successful. And briefly, I just want to mention the two bombers that they did have, horizontal bombers on when Barbarossa took place, the Heinkel HE-111 and the Ju-88. They were both medium bombers, two-engine bombers with very modest bomb loads. I think I pointed out that the Heinkel only carried about 4,000 pounds, and the Ju-88 could carry a little bit more. Now, it's interesting to also note that the original Barbarossa directive from the 18th of December, 1940, failed to even assign a strategic mission to the Luftwaffe for the Russian campaign. And this is no doubt based on the conviction that in a short blitzkrieg style campaign, it was hardly required to do so. That is to perform a strategic mission. For the attack on Russia, then, the role of the Luftwaffe was twofold. First, to gain air superiority and, if possible, even total air supremacy. And secondly, to support the ground forces for the duration of their mobile operations. And only after the general line of the Volga, Archangel, and Astrakhan had been reached were strategic operations to be conducted, if necessary, by bomber forces to eliminate Russia's whatever residual resources they had, industrial centers and so forth, in the Urals. Now, I will point out that the 1941 campaign did did witness a few abortive attempts of the Luftwaffe to conduct strategic air campaign. I believe on the 21st of July, they conducted the first air attack on Moscow with something around 100, 150 airplanes. And this offensive would be kept up into the spring with an ever dwindling number of aircraft, most of the time, instead of large numbers, they would just attack with maybe 15, 20 planes, whatever. And again, these were just pinprick attacks that accomplished very little. And they also attempted to conduct something of a strategic air campaign over Leningrad, which was equally ineffective. So these attacks were too desultory to have any impact or any significant impact. And then, of course, I did mention that it was not until 43 and 44, and using the HE-177 and, of course, still the Heinkel 111 horizontal bombers, they did make in those latter years of the war an attempt at a strategic air campaign, a more serious attempt, but it was a failure. Now, a little bit about the Luftwaffe. These are slides 11 to 14. The Luftwaffe buildup, or Aufmarsch, as they called it in the East, the Luftwaffe's order of battle, and a little bit more on the missions. Okay, the Luftwaffe had, you want to move that up a little bit, Jim, to slide 11? Jim, are you there? Maybe I already put him to sleep.
No, that's all right. This is the slide I have in order. This is the one on the Air Fleet number 1.
Slide 11. Let me see what that shows.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, it has Luftflotte 1. Luftwaffe buildup in the East and Luftflotte 1. Yes.
Right there, right?
I'm still seeing the Richthofen slides.
Yeah.
Oh, weird. Okay. What are you seeing now?
Same thing.
No change.
Oh, weird.
Okay, right.
Weird.
Well, while you're looking for that, I will plug away here. So anyway, the Luftwaffe had completed its plans for the Eastern campaign by late February 41 and issued sealed orders. There you go. Issued sealed orders to aircrew, which were not to be opened until 8 hours before H hour. The construction of airfields, provision of accommodations, and other preparatory activities had started in the fall of 1941, continued through the winter, and then accelerated in the spring of 41 as the weather improved. However, it was only in April and May of 1941 that actual preparations for the arrival of the flying units began to go forward in occupied Poland, including the establishment of administrative supply units, aircraft maintenance shops, equipment issuing stations, and so forth. And of course, all these initiatives proceeded as unobtrusively as possible with every conceivable security precaution. And as an aside, I just think that's one thing that people don't realize. When we think of great deceptive measures, or what the Russians would call maskirovka during the Second World War, we think, for example, of Patton and his fake army group in northern England that kept the Germans thinking that the Normandy landing in June of 44 was a fake, and that a whole massive army was going to be coming straight across the Channel in the weeks that followed into the Pas-de-Calais. But of course, that army group never existed. This fake wireless traffic, dummy tanks, the whole bit. Well, the German disinformation campaign, if you will, prior to Barbarossa was also one of the most successful strategic what should you call it? Strategic disinformation campaigns or deception campaigns of the Second World War. It was exquisitely planned, granularly detailed, and extremely effective. I think, as we all know, given how surprised the Soviet leadership was when the Germans actually attacked. Now, to preclude possible detection, the transfer of Luftwaffe units to the east was delayed to the last possible moment. Motorized elements of Luftwaffe ground organization, including anti-aircraft signal units, were deployed by rail and road, and these movements had largely been completed by the 15th of June, 1941. The assignment of flying units to the Eastern Front was accomplished in its entirety in the period of just 3 weeks by the 20th and 21st of June, 41. And that was the same 3-week period when the German ground forces were moving up something like 24 mechanized, tank and motorized infantry divisions to the front. So it sort of paralleled that. And gradually, under conditions of strictest secrecy, supported by radio deception measures, Luftwaffe units were pulled out of operations against Great Britain. The first to be withdrawn were the fighter units, which were not required for the night air offensive that was still going on at that time, albeit in a rather desultory fashion. The last ones to be pulled out and moved east were the bomber units, which had conducted the aerial offensive were still involved in bombing attacks over England. Now, as much as possible, the flying formations were first shifted to their home bases for brief periods of rest and rehabilitation. And from there, the aircraft were brought up to their prepared airfields in the east in individual flights or in small formations of several planes, Ketten as they called them, and avoiding larger urban areas as a security precaution. So you could see they didn't move the planes up to the front in large numbers. They just even did them sort of in onesies, twosies, stayed away from large conurbations in order to enhance secrecy. However, the deployment of the Luftwaffe in the east did not remain hidden from British radio intelligence, which through Ultra, and we all know what that is, the famous code breaking of the German Enigma machines, the British was able to read the German Air Force's code. So they had a pretty good idea what was going on. And I should also point out something I learned years ago in studying Ultra from one of my books. The Luftwaffe was notoriously bad when it came to their wireless security. So they were a rich source of signals for the Allies when it came to Ultra. Now, Kesselring, the Field Marshal Kesselring, the commander of the Second Air Fleet, he did not leave the Channel Coast until the 12th or 13th of June, heading first to Berlin for a final pre-Barbarossa conference. I think that was the big conference held on the 14th of June at the Reichschancellery. And according to official German pronouncements, however, he was still with his bombers in the West, where bogus German wireless transmissions throughout the first days of June sought to convey the impression that certain Luftwaffe units were still operating against England and not deploying to the east. Several days later, Kesselring flew on from Berlin and landed at an airfield just outside Warsaw, where he joined his headquarters staff and then threw himself into final preparations. Now, Luftflotte 1, this is the one you have up there now. This was commanded by Generaloberst Keller, and it provided support to Army Group North as it advanced from East Prussia across the Dvina River toward and through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. And you can see we're talking only a total of barely 450 combat aircraft, a combat ready aircraft, a little over 200 bombers, a little more than 150 fighters along a ground front that initially was about 300 kilometers in length for Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North. Did you want to show that map, Jim, or not?
I will. Hold on.
Fine. Yeah, there you go. There you can see, bringing up a little bit more. You can see the front of all the air units, the headquarters just north of Norrköping of the First Air Fleet, and then the locations of the various fighter and bomber units. And as I noted, Keller did not have any Stukas in his order of battle. Now, the objectives of his air fleet at the start of the campaign were fivefold, essentially. Rapidly gain air superiority by destroying Soviet airfields and aircraft, providing fighter protection for advancing ground forces, interdiction of Soviet rail and road traffic between the Neman and the Dvina rivers, direct and indirect support of ground forces with this small number of bombers, and then attacking. There was another unit, German aerial unit, which was to attack the Soviet Baltic fleet at sea and its bases with bombs and mines while tying up merchant shipping in the Baltic. And within these basic parameters, the 3 bomber wings and lone fighter wings of Forster's 1 Air Corps, that was one of the 2 Air Corps assigned to Keller's First Air Fleet, were to focus their efforts supporting Generaloberst Erich Hoppner's 4th Panzer Group as it began its drive on Leningrad, some 700 kilometers to the northeast as the crow flies. Now, we can go to the 2nd Air Fleet. There you go. Let me see. Down, up, there you go. This is the area of, at least part of the area of the 2nd Air Fleet. And if you can see the salient that sort of juts out into Russian territory, you'll see the town of Suwalki. And that is essentially the Suwalki, what the Germans called the Suwalki Gipfel or salient. And you can see a lot of the Stuka squadrons were just below that town. The Stuka Geschwader 1, the 1st Stuka wing with its 2nd and 3rd Gruppen, Stuka Gruppen. And a Gruppe normally had somewhere between 30 and 40 planes. And then you see other units there. The Jagdgeschwader, 2nd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 52, and then the 10th Squadron of LG2. And I don't remember what LG is. And then you see a little behind that, the second squadron with the F in parentheses, that's Fernaufklärung. That would be a long-range aerial reconnaissance squad.
Just quickie, Lehrgeschwader. LG is L.
Oh, Lehr, yeah, training.
Training.
Yeah, like a training. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Rob. So the second so his air fleet. So we're on to just lost my train of thought here. Okay. Kesselring's air fleet had 2 air corps. The second air corps under General der Flieger Bruno Lorzer, and that was on the left flank of Theodor von Bock's Army Group Center, largely supporting Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group. And his units were stationed on airfields near Warsaw, around Brest-Litovsk, Deblin, and so forth. And then you had the 8th Air Corps, which we've talked quite a bit about, Richthofen's Corps, with many of its airfields in the Suwalki Triangle there. And most of the Ju-87 Ju-87Bs were, of course, with his 8th Air Corps. Now, the infantry, panzer, and motorized units of Army Group Center, excuse me, were deployed along a frontier approximately 500 kilometers in length from the northern tip of the Suwalki Triangle south past the Soviet fortress of Brest-Litovsk. And I'll have to tell you, the area, the little Suwalki Gipfel that juts out was one of the most underdeveloped places in probably all of Europe in June of 1941. And the border there between Poland and Lithuania is exactly in the same place now as it was then. In fact, when I was doing research for the volume I published, when I edited and annotated the memoir of Dr. Heinrich Hoppe, Moscow Tram Stop, he was with the 6th Infantry Division and in the elite 18th Infantry Regiment, way up on the far northern or left flank of Army Group Center. And we literally, I was with Dr. Hoppe's son, and we were following the route of his dad's infantry regiment all the way from the Suwalki Triangle all the way through Lithuania, Belarus, to the city of Rzhev, about 220 kilometers west and a little north of Moscow. But we stood in the Suwalki Triangle, right on the hill, probably almost exactly where Dr. Hoppe had stood on the morning of the 22nd of June when they launched their attack. So that's just kind of an interesting little aside. And in the memoir that we republished in 2020, we have color photos of the trip we took. So you'll see the photo of us standing there, me with Dr. Hoppe's son. So getting back to my discussion, Army Group Center had a front about 500 kilometers in length that Kesselring's 2nd Luftflotte had to cover. And the tactical dispositions of Bock's Army Group, with the Panzer Group poised to attack on each wing, as I pointed out, prefigured the intention to rapidly encircle and destroy Red Army forces of the Western Military District, which of course became the Western Front immediately after the Germans attacked. And they were to accomplish this, to encircle these forces as close to the Russo-German frontier as possible. And the primary mission of Kesselring's Luftflotte was, first of all, again, just like with Keller farther north, to establish air superiority, even air supremacy, then provide air support for both of the panzer groups on the wings of Bock's army group. Okay, the next slide, 17, is Luftflotte 4, and that was the air fleet that supported Army Group South, and it was commanded by the 56-year-old Generaloberst Alexander Löhr. And it began, I didn't mention how many. Oh, I forgot to mention how many planes Kesselring had with his second air fleet. Total of 994 combat-ready planes, including, as I pointed out, all of the Stukas on the Eastern Front, except for those up in the north, 323 of them. And Kesselring also had control over the first Flak Corps with its large complement of 88 millimeter guns, which would prove highly effective in both an air and a ground support role. In fact, they would often be the only answer the Germans had initially. You can see the gun there, the 88 millimeter, was the only answer the Germans had to the T-34 or the Soviet KV-1 or 2 tanks. Okay, getting back to the South and the 4th Air Fleet, Löhr had almost 900 aircraft of all types, 300 bombers, almost 300 fighters, and he also had the 2nd Flak Corps, which controlled something like eight flak battalions, and would play a significant role protecting the spearheads of Generaloberst von Kleist's Panzer Group, his first Panzer Group. Now,
let me, Craig, let me just get that big map up again. Just
yeah, sure.
And Mark, you had a question. You've had your hand up for a long time.
Mark? Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jim. Craig, this is an awesome presentation. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'd like to take you to your excellent slide about a while ago on the losses, the absolute and relative losses of the Luftwaffe in the France and everything. By June 22nd, to what extent had the Luftwaffe made up its losses in terms of personnel and equipment?
Well, if you go back to the beginning, the opening slides, you'll see that the total force structure of the Luftwaffe had only grown by about 100 aircraft from the beginning of the French campaign in 1940 to the beginning of the Russian campaign in 1941. Because the army got a respite during that period, except for the short Balkan campaign, but the Luftwaffe was still fighting. It was fighting in the Mediterranean. It was fighting against the England and so forth. So it never got that kind of a respite, and was still suffering significant attrition. And you can point to certain things like the attack that on Malta, not Malta, Crete, that just preceded Barbarossa, where their transport fleet of Ju-52s was just decimated, just utterly decimated. I don't remember how many planes they lost exactly, but in triple figures. I know that. So they were going into Barbarossa with an Luftwaffe force structure, which wasn't much different what they had in the French campaign. And not to get into it now, I think I talked about it in my talk a few weeks ago. You could say the same thing about their ground forces. They may have had changed out a lot of the obsolete Panzer ones and twos with Panzer threes and fours, and done other things to, they had, for example, a 250 or 350 or 300 assault guns, where they'd only had, I think, 10 experimental assault guns, Stug 3s, at the start of the French campaign. So they had done things on the ground as well to improve the firepower of their forces. They were introducing the 550 millimeter anti-tank gun, which still wasn't enough in most cases to take on the T-34. But in a sense, they attacked with the same Air Force and the same ground force in June 1941 that they had in June 1940 when they attacked France. Does that kind of answer your question?
Totally. Thank you very much.
You bet. Sure, no problem. Okay. Now the mission of Luhr's Fourth Air Fleet was it was to attack Soviet air forces, establish air superiority, provide direct and indirect support of Army Group South, concentrating that support on the left wing, where the Sixth Army, Reichenau's Sixth Army, and Kleist's First Panzer Group were advancing toward to the Dnieper, toward the Kiev and the Dnieper River, attempting to prevent the withdrawal of Soviet forces across the river. They were also to conduct attacks in the Black Sea to destroy the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. Funny how history is, Mark Twain or somebody said, it may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, doesn't it? What's happening to the Soviet Black Sea Fleet now in the current conflict. And then they were also to disrupt Soviet merchant shipping and transport vessels in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. All right, let's go kinetic. Y'all ready to go kinetic? We'll talk a little bit about what actually happened here. Okay, there you go. And some of these pictures are a little arbitrary, but I kind of liked them, so I threw them in there. So as noted in the War Diary of Army Group North, the first wave of Keller's First Air Fleet consisted of 76 Ju-88A bombers and 90 Bf-109 fighters. Together, they set out for 7 Soviet airfields earmarked for destructions. Far to the north, and this was the other air unit I alluded to a minute ago, Air Leader Baltic began to deposit minefields, Minenspelen, in the waters around Leningrad and the Soviet naval base at Kronstadt, while also conducting attacks on enemy shipping in the Baltic Sea. As a result of teething problems with new models of VVS aircraft just entering service, the frontline airfields in Lithuania, Soviet-occupied Lithuania, were packed with aircraft of all types, old and new, because the airfield construction program had not kept pace with the need to shelter such a vast number of planes. And as you can imagine, that state of affairs rendered the destruction of these aircraft that much more inevitable. The Soviets in the year so. Oh, my dear wife has something for me. She's off to the store. My dear. In the months before Barbarossa, the Soviets had undertaken a massive campaign to construct new airfields as close to the frontier as possible. Some of them literally just a matter of a few kilometers or miles from the frontier. It is thus hardly surprising that the airmen of one air fleet's one bomber wing, the Hindenburg wing, the first raid to them seemed little more than a gunnery training exercise. Okay, and I'll go into just give some details on a few of these individual attacks to just sort of give you a feeling for what happened all across the front, because otherwise I would get entirely repetitive, because it was the same thing all along the 1,200 kilometer front. But in any case, this bomber wing, the first target of its Ju-88As was the airfield at Lipaja or Libau on the Baltic coast, nearly 200 kilometers from the Baltic, from the bomber group's base in East Prussia. Excuse me, my eye is bothering me. Recalled Hauptmann Gerhard Becker, the group's technical officer, quote, "At 0211 hours, we took off on our first mission against the east. It was a clear night, and the horizon was bright from the midnight sun in the far north. Our target was the airfield in Lithuania. The base was occupied by a fighter unit, and its so-called I-16 Ratas stood parked in nice, tight rows, offering us a good target in the bright night," end quote. The German medium bombers loosed their bombs onto, quote, "long rows of completely uncamouflaged aircraft standing in close formation as though on parade along the edges of the Lipaja airfield." Not sure I'm pronouncing that. My Lithuanian's a little rusty at this point. So it was again, it was just like a gunnery training exercise, and this happened again and again. Was a common experience for the German fighter Stuka and bomber crews. And throughout the 22nd of June, Keller's fighters and bombers maintained a torrid pace of operation, flying multiple missions that also targeted Soviet ground forces in an effort to clear the way for the tanks of Hoppner's 4th Panzer Group. Now here, just as an aside, stationed opposite Ritter von Lieb's Army Group North, kind of on, as I recall, on Lieb's right flank, was the poor Soviet 125th Rifle Division. That thing got thoroughly beat up. I don't know if any of it existed after the 22nd of June. It got smashed from the air, and it got hit by, I think, 5 or 6 German divisions almost simultaneously, because it stood directly in the path of Hoppner's tanks. I should also point out that tens of thousands of Soviet citizens of non-Baltic origin who had been engaged in Sovietizing and Russifying the recently acquired Baltic states, they also suffered serious losses from air attack as they sought to flee on the few available roads back to the Soviet Union, disrupting the movement of Red Army reserves as they did so. And I should also point out that air attacks such as this by German fighter planes on columns of civilians attempting to escape from the battlefield were quite common, very, very well, unfortunately, very, as I said, very common and very well documented in both German and Soviet accounts. Now, the next one on to Kesselring's Luftflotte 2. And the picture you see there, I don't know, Rob, what is that? Is that a BT-7, that tank? Something like that?
Yeah,
Russian tank.
that's a good guess.
Yeah, and some. This is the result of a according to the caption, the result of a German Stuka attack. But Kesselring's attack was a little different. He had a lot more planes, of course, and it got underway at 0300, just 15 minutes before the ground invasion began, with 30 Heinkel 111s and Dornier DO-17Z medium bombers, which were elements of three Kampfgeschwader of three different bomb wings. And these planes flew in groups of three. They were manned by hand-picked crews who had lots of night flying experience. They crossed the Russo-German frontier at high altitude and struck out for Soviet fighter bases between Belostok and Minsk and at other points along the line of Army Group Center's advance. Then by 0315 hours, these bombers were coming in at low level and they disgorged hundreds of SD-2 fragmentation bombs from their open bomb bays. And then, as I write here, very dramatically, the 2-kilogram bombs burst among the rows of Soviet aircraft, which were uncamouflaged and arranged wingtip to wingtip on their airfields with personnel tents located nearby. A flurry of rapid explosions soon engulfed the rows of aircraft. Airframes were shedded and fuel tanks punctured, the latter evoking multiple fireballs that tossed columns of dense black smoke up into the dawn sky. In the attendant chaos, dazed ground crews struggled frantically to put out the fires, but were frustrated by delayed action explosions. With no instructions from superior headquarters, each base coped as best it could. And then, as the sun rose, these initial attacks were followed by the main body of Kesselring's strike force of hundreds of medium bombers, dive bombers, fighters, and destroyer aircraft. And I should point out that the weather was absolutely ideal. It was warm, sunny, hardly a cloud in the sky. And again, while the paramount objectives were, as they were along the entire front for the Luftwaffe, the destruction of enemy air forces and the establishment of air superiority, a wide array of other targets were also struck in this opening assault. In the opening assault, the Germans hit here on the Central Front, in addition to 31 airfields, they struck trains and railway cars. The Germans here using incendiary bullets, special incendiary bullets to destroy cars filled with fuel, gasoline and grain warehouses, fuel dumps, barracks, bunkers, and suspected locations of senior Red Army staffs were also targeted, and often quite successfully from the air. And this included the headquarters of the Soviet Fourth Army, which I think was opposite Guderian's attack on the ground, and it was obliterated by a clutch of Ju-88 bombers at the start of the attack. And then, of course, Stuka dive bombers launched all kinds of precision attacks on tanks, trucks, bridges, bunkers, fieldworks, artillery, anti-aircraft sites, and so on, while bombers of the 2nd and 8th Air Corps struck a large number of towns and cities with high explosives and incendiary bombs. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this because I don't want to keep you all here too much longer. I just wanted to provide one example, or two examples here. Hans Ulrich Rudel, flying with the Stuka Geschwader 2, the so-called Immelmann wing of the 8th Air Corps, he talks at length about his first dive bomber missions in his his iconic Eastern Front memoir, and these were the first missions that he flew. And he flew, I don't know, 5 or 6 on that day, as did many of the Stuka pilots. And that's one of the amazing things. I'll wait to talk about how many Stukas were shot down. I'll have interesting information on that in a minute. But Rudel, like so many other German pilots that day, was literally awed by the massive buildup of Red Army forces at the frontier. And from that, they all drew pretty much the same sinister conclusion. That, in other words, thank God that we struck now, because we have just preempted an impending Russian attack on us. And then no account of Luftwaffe operations on the 22nd of June would be complete without addressing the exploits of Major Werner Mulders. He was the commander of Jagdgeschwader, Fighter Wing 51 of Lorzer's 2nd Air Corps. He was 28 years old and one of Germany's top flying aces. And early that morning, Mulders and his 4 Bf-109F Gruppen began operations from a cluster of bases east and southeast of Warsaw, flying with his staff's flight of 4 aircraft, what the Germans called a Schwarm, alongside the pilots of the second Gruppe of his fighter wing. Mulders achieved his first kill of the day and 69th of the war at 0500 hours. The victim, an I-153 biplane. His second and third aerial victories, 70 and 71, came at 12:35 and 12:36 hours, when he shot 2 SB bombers out of the sky. 2 minutes later, 12:38 hours, he recorded his 4th and final kill of the day and 72nd of his career, another SB bomber. And for his 72nd aerial victory, the Fuhrer himself sent Mulders a congratulatory telegram and awarded him the swords to the Knight's Cross with oak's leaf, with the oak leaves. Now here's the, as Paul Harvey would say, here's the rest of the story. Attempting to return to Berlin after an inspection tour of frontline units in the Ukraine in November 1941, Mulders was killed when his Heinkel 111, in which he was a passenger, crashed in bad weather near Breslau and broke apart. Okay, while the brilliantly executed attacks on Soviet airfields went forward without surcease, other components of Kesselring's 2 air fleet fought above the spearheads of Army Group Center's 2 panzer groups. And on this day, these bombers and fighter bombers played a significant part in crushing Soviet counterattacks with armor against the forwardmost elements of Guderian's 2 panzer group, even bombing the command post of the Soviet 14 Mechanized Corps and cutting its communication links. On the left flank of Army Group Center, the Luftwaffe came to the aid of Hoth's 3 Panzer Group when it struck Soviet armor with its Stukas, smashing a group of Soviet tanks in the Grodno region in front of Generaloberst Strauss's 9th Army, while also destroying the headquarters of the Soviet 3 Army at Grozno. Now, I'm going to skip, just for the sake of time, but very quickly just on the Luftflotte 4, the 4th Air Fleet on Rundstedt's front. It's basically the same thing. They struck some 29 airfields as far south as the Black Sea coast. Bombers struck Odessa, Sevastopol, and other cities. And as the Germans might say, for the German fighter pilots and bomber crews, it was das alte Lied, the same old story, as the enemy was totally unprepared for the catastrophe that befell it. And here, one pilot of a Bf 109 pointed out in his diary, quote, "We hardly believed our eyes. Row after row of reconnaissance planes, bombers, and fighters stood lined up as if on parade," unquote. Okay, now there's one other, so that basically what happened on the 22nd of June. The Soviet air forces, like the ground forces, were caught totally unawares. The Russians, of course, were in the middle of a changeover of their force structure, which included not just their ground, but also their air forces. So they were trying to replace some of their older aircraft, like the Ratas, the I-16s, and so forth, with newer planes like the MiG-1 and the Log-3 and so forth. But they were just building these new airfields. Their planes were sitting there wingtip to wingtip, uncamouflaged, and of course, just incredibly easy targets. And we'll get to the final results of the day in terms of losses shortly. But I wanted to talk very briefly about one of the strangest things that happened on the 22nd of June. Really remarkable things. And that is the operations of Soviet bombers. And I have a personal account here. I neglected to write down where I got it, but it might come from Cage's or Becker's book, The Luftwaffe War Diaries, but I'm not sure. But here's a report from that addresses these Soviet bomber operations from the German perspective. And I'm quoting, "As the morning of June 22nd slipped slowly by, something odd began to appear. Soviet bombers in large numbers, apparently coming out of nowhere, began to strike at the advancing German troops or to bomb East Prussian cities and bases in German-occupied Poland. The phenomenon is graphically recounted by Cage's Becker in his book, Luftwaffe War Diaries. No one knew where the Soviet bombers came from, whether it was from far away, from the airfields already blitzed, or from others so far undetected. In any case, there they were, 10, 20, 30 of them in compact formation, and they attacked. It happened just after the Gruppen of Major Graf Schönborn's Stückegeschwader 77 had re-landed after their first operation against fortified lines on the Bug River. There were 5 explosions, then 5 black mushrooms of smoke on the opposite boundary. Only then were the bombers sighted. 6 twin-engine machines turning away in a wide curve. At this moment, 2 or 3 little dots were seen approaching the bombers at full speed, German fighters. They treated the Stuka crews on the ground to a breathtaking spectacle. As one Stuka commander, Helmut Papst, reported, as the first one fired, meaning the Bf 109s, thin threads of smoke seemed to join it to the bomber. Turning ponderously to the side, the big bird flashed silver, then plunged vertically downwards with its engines screaming. As it crashed, a huge sheet of flame shot upwards. The second bomber became a glare of red, exploded as it dived, and only the bits came floating down like great autumnal leaves. The third turned over backwards on fire. A similar fate befell the rest, the last falling in a village and burning for an hour. 6 columns of smoke rose from the horizon. All 6 had been shot down. But this was just one example, for the same thing happened along the entire front. The Russian bombers came in, held to their course, made no attempt to evade either flak or fighters. Their losses were frightful. When 10 had already been shot down, another 15 would appear on the scene. They went on coming the whole afternoon, Pabst continues. From our airfield alone, we saw 21 crash and none got away. So that's the end of a long quote. But then Field Marshal Kesselring was so bewildered by what he saw. And this is in so many accounts of German soldiers who saw this happening on the 22nd of June and just were gobsmacked and reported about it. He was so bewildered by the behavior of these Soviet bomber crews and their willingness to literally face certain death that he labeled what he saw, he labeled it in his memoir as infanticide or kindermord. In his memoir, he also stated that the destruction of the German bomber force in the first few days of the war was so complete, so final, that it was rendered a non-factor in the months that followed. Now, as we'll see, I don't believe that's entirely true, but that's what he said. And I'd also like to point out that I believe in one of his many books, David Glantz pointed out these Russian bomber tactics, that they would come in their tight formations, take no evasive action whatsoever, always coming in, I think if I recall correctly, at about 5,000 feet, not too high, and they would just get absolutely slaughtered. I don't know, it just says something about the Eastern European mentality to me. I just can't see Americans or Brits doing that. It's just an utterly amazing thing. Okay, now we're almost getting to the end here. Slides 19 and 20. The results of the first day. By midday, the Germans were claiming the destruction of almost 900 Soviet aircraft across the front. 222 in aerial combat or to anti-aircraft fire, and fully 668 on the ground, with the loss of only 18 Luftwaffe planes. And late that afternoon, the commander of the Western Front's Air Forces, Major General Ivan Ivanovich Kopets, obviously overcome by this burgeoning catastrophe, he took his life, which is probably good that he did, because if he hadn't, Stalin would have most likely done it for him a few weeks later. At 23:40 hours, in other words, at the very end of the day, the chief of staff of one air fleet telephoned his counterpart at Army Group North and informed him that the operations of his air fleet had resulted in the destruction of 185 Soviet aircraft. The great majority of these destroyed on the ground. Numbers, those are relatively modest numbers to what Army Group, the 2nd and 4th Air Fleet were able to do. The 2nd Air Fleet, which of course had many more combat aircraft, recorded more than 900, having destroyed more than 900 VVS aircraft. And as a result, the Luftwaffe succeeded in gaining complete air superiority, in the sector of Army Group Center on the first day of the war. The losses of the VVS, the Soviet Air Force, were so enormous and they're literally historically unprecedented. They lost on 22nd of June something like 1,811 aircraft, 322 in the air or destroyed by any aircraft fire, and fully 1,489, in other words, the vast majority on the ground. Then the Soviets, on the next day, on the 23rd of June, would write off an additional 800 aircraft. And so it pretty much seemed that the Luftwaffe had gained not just air superiority, but total air supremacy. In other words, it completely swept the Soviet Air Force from the sky. On the 24th of June, the chief of the Army General Staff, Halder, would write in his diary that the Soviet Air Force was now completely out of the picture, völlig im Hintertreffen, after the very high losses. By 30 June 1941, the Germans were reporting the destruction of 4,614 Soviet aircraft, if you can imagine that. And I'll also point out Goering, Reichsmarshal Goering, was so taken aback by these numbers that, to use more modern vernacular, he thought they were fake news. So he actually sent out a couple of officers to explore the situation, and they actually came back and said, well, Reichsmarshal, we actually shot down more planes than we thought. So that's kind of an interesting aside. Now, what about the Luftwaffe? And this is kind of interesting. It is noted with palpable irony that Luftwaffe losses at the onset of the Russian campaign were, one can reasonably argue, even more significant than those of their adversary. Well, how can that be? On this day, and this is according to relatively newer information, the Germans lost, and these are total irrecoverable losses, 78 planes, 61 to enemy action, and 17 to other causes. Okay, 78 planes to 1,811 lost by the Russians, right? Well, those 78 planes amounted to 3% of the Luftwaffe's operational strength of 2,250 planes in the Eastern Theater. And numerically, they signified the greatest single day's loss to date since the start of World War II on September 1st, 1939. And losses among air crews were also serious, among them 113 dead or missing and dozens more wounded. Now, historians had traditionally maintained that only 35 or 36 German planes were actually lost on this day. However, a well-documented study of German fighter units on the Eastern Front, published in 2003, offered convincing evidence that the actual number was what I had pointed out, 78 to be exact, and he has it there, as you saw, broken down by planes. And one of the interesting things about that is you see how Ju-87 Stukas, only 2 Stukas, again, they had 323 operational Stukas on the front of Army Group Center, and only 2 of them were lost on this day. And you got to figure these Stukas flew 4, 5, 6, even more missions. So if you do a little basic math, you take 300 planes and you say they flew, just say they flew 5 missions. That would be 1,500 missions. They could have flown as many as 2,000, and only 2 of them were lost. And I know for a fact from the memoir of a German soldier who I think was with the 18th Panzer Division, one of those Stukas was shot down by friendly fire. And when you consider the mission profile, which I discussed in some detail, of the Stuka, I find it utterly remarkable that only 2 Stukas were lost on this day. You may recall, or you may not even be aware of this, something that I just learned about recently. In April of 1939, just before the war started, the Germans were putting Luftwaffe put on an aerial display with its Stukas, and something went catastrophically wrong. It was an entire Stuka squadron, some 13, 14 planes, and they had gotten meteorological data from their ground crew telling them that the cloud cover was at a certain height. Well, they gave them improper information. The cloud cover was actually much lower than the Stuka pilots thought. All 13, I think of those 13 planes, I think all but one of them went straight into the ground, which is just an unbelievable thing. In any case, getting back to Luftwaffe attrition, by the 30th of June, the Luftwaffe had already written off some 330 aircraft, well over 10% of their force. And by July 12th, total losses had soared to 550, or 25% of its operational strength at the start of the campaign. So let's get to some conclusions here on slide 21. Okay, in terms of sheer numbers of planes destroyed by the Luftwaffe on the 22nd of June, no other air force in history has ever come close to matching these numbers before or since. That's quite obvious. Yet the Luftwaffe's achievement, extraordinary to be sure, was not nearly so absolute as it appeared to be, and as many historians have interpreted it to be. Simply put, despite its astronomical losses, the Soviet Air Force, from the very outset of the war, continued to make its presence felt, often significantly so. And there were many reasons for this. Perhaps foremost among them was the fact that the Luftwaffe, operating along a front that grew dramatically in length the farther east the Germans went, was simply too small in numbers to maintain the requisite pressure on the VVS, that is, to conduct the air superiority mission, while also meeting the burgeoning demands of the Army for air support. And another factor was simply the remarkable regenerative powers of the Red Army, which was able to infuse the battlefield with an unending stream of new formations, both on the ground and in the air. As a result, as early as 4 July, in other words, we're talking what, a little more than 2 weeks into the start of the campaign, Kesselring's air fleet was reporting that despite the VVS's heavy losses, the number of Russian aircraft they were encountering had hardly declined, while the Army was beginning to complain that in certain sectors, the Soviets had even regained air superiority, and that the, quote, direction of Soviet air units was increasingly marked by a clear-headed and aggressive leadership. And just another statistic, that the Soviet Air Force remained active during the summer of 1941 is also supported by some statistics here. And these are from the Soviet official history of the air war, which posits that the VVS flew a grand total of 47,000 sorties through July 9th. The 22nd of June to July 9th is generally considered the 17-day period of the frontier battles. In other words, during that period, after the shattering impact of the first few days of the campaign, they still managed to average something like 2,500 sorties a day, including thousands that were flown by Soviet bombers. Now, the thing is, they were remarkably ineffective. That's all I can say. And there's even, I think it's, if I recall, Hans Luck, Luck, a German panzer commander, in his memoir even wrote at one point that the Soviet bombers were coming over again, and we didn't even budge because they never caused us any problems. And at one point, he pointed out that they had literally dropped nails out of their bomb bays. So that's kind of an odd thing. But there's another side of the story too. Starting in July, Red Army air units also began actively striking German airfields. And on the 8th of July, they conducted a very effective attack against 40 German airfields on the Western Front, where they destroyed or damaged 54 German planes. And the point here is not that the Soviet air forces saw a dramatic reversal of fortune as early as the beginning of July. It didn't, and it would not until the fall and winter of 41-42. It's simply that the VVS was never, quote, completely out of the picture, unquote, to use Halder's phrase, and continued to generate a surprisingly high number of sorties despite its horrendous losses. And one other thing on that, I've read too many accounts like the following one here, which was written on the 1st of July by a German doctor who recently published a terrific book. He was serving with Models, General Models, 3rd Panzer Division at Bobrusk on the Berezina River at this point. And he points out, yesterday at the edge of the forest, this is again, remember, this is the 1st of July, 10 days after the German attack. Quote, yesterday at the edge of the forest, we again experienced many air attacks. They seemed to attack every 15 minutes. One could hardly catch a minute of sleep because of the racket. In our sector alone, I saw 32 enemy planes shot down. Anyway, let me end with a couple of additional comments here. As far as the impact of the Soviet Air Force in the opening weeks and months of the campaign, I'll quote a former VVS officer who said that on the whole, these actions of Soviet aviation against enemy troops did not have a noticeable influence on the success of the ground troops' defensive actions in the initial period of war. VVS efforts were often dispersed. Planes were not massed adequately in the major sectors. The weapon selection and the method and altitude of bomb strikes were not always appropriate, and the tactics of bomber and ground attack aviation did not fit the situation. So here are two I'd like to end this discussion with something very ironic. 3rd of July, 1941. I'm sure everyone here, I certainly know Rob is familiar with what the chief of the German Army General Staff, Franz Halder, wrote in his private diary on the 3rd of July. And I don't have it in front of me, but I have it almost memorized like a Bible verse. Something like, on the whole, remember, this is 2 weeks into the campaign. On the whole, one can say that the Red Army has been destroyed in 2 weeks' time. And from this point forward, it's just a matter of mopping up. Okay, so that was the impression of the German General Staff 2 weeks into the campaign. But there was a very different impression on the part of the Luftwaffe leadership, or at least this individual in the Luftwaffe leadership. And I'm talking about General von Waldau, who was the deputy to Genesek. He was the deputy to the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff. And he published his diary, which I think I got out of the German Federal Military Archives. And this is all in what I have here. This quote is in German, so I'm just gonna translate a couple of little parts of it. And again, this is in response. This is Luftwaffe deputy to the chief of the Luftwaffe chief of staff, the same day, the 3rd of July, talking about the situation in the East. And he says the military power of the Soviet Union is much stronger as our investigations at the beginning of the war led us to believe. He goes on to say that we had misinterpreted many of the numbers that we got, or the Russians were giving out, as simply just drivel, just propaganda. And then he goes on to say that the material qualität, the material is better than expected. Individually, we're surprised by the numbers, by the numerical strength of the Luftwaffe. Then he goes on to say that we have learned that they had a total of 8,000. Now, this is just what, I don't know how totally accurate that is, but they had something like 8,000 operational aircraft that were ready when the campaign got underway. And then he goes on to say that their motorization and the number of tanks just goes beyond anything that we'd thought imaginable. And he continues talking about the Widerstandswille, the will to resist, the toughness of their troops just went beyond anything we thought conceivable. And then he makes an observation which I think is very, very significant. He says that it can be determined that the idea of communism, the ideology of communism, was a much more powerful, much more of a force multiplier for the Red Army than we ever thought. So these are just fascinating to put these comments side by side, where you have the chief of the German general staff saying, "Yep, the war's over," and then you have von Waldau, this high-ranking Luftwaffe official, just actually having a much more accurate assessment of the situation. So I will end by pointing out the Luftwaffe. I don't remember who sent that to me, but you can see it right there. That is the secret weapon that Hitler, for some reason, decided never to employ. Thank God for all of us he didn't, or we'd all be speaking German now or eating really shitty pancakes, one or the other. So I'm done.
All right. Well, thank you. Wow, what a great talk. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. Sorry it went on so long.
No, that's all right. And there's going to be more to it. Now, Alex has his hand up. Go on, Alex. Well, Alex is going away from his phone there. Okay. Let me just throw in this to just add to the mix here. Because we don't have Von Hardesty or Ilya Greenberg here today, so they could illuminate. But I just want to raise some questions from the map of the German official history in terms of the deployment of the Red Air Force. And both myself, and I'm not going to get into depth, we can get into depth on this at another time. I just want to raise some of these questions. Craig and I were going over this yesterday, and what you're seeing here is the estimate that is on the map with these are different designations of bomber wings and fighter regiments and bomber regiments of the Red Air Force. The key is this. I'm going to go to the key so you see. This is the estimate as of March 1st, 1941. So these are the symbols showing what the Germans felt as of what they estimated as of March 1st, 1941. And here you'll see that they don't know where these guys are as of the 21st of June. Is that correct? Is that how I'm reading that German, Craig?
Yeah, yeah. And on the first one for March 21st at the bottom in parentheses, what that is saying is that the location of these units is only partly known. But then it says on the one on the far right, where they're all in the boxes, it says Standorte unbekannt, the locations of these units. I mean, they think those units exist, but they don't know where they are.
All right. Now, so let's start from the south. So here is the air power deployed opposite the Germans of Army Group South deployed in Romania. And as you can see, there's a large, again, we'd have to calibrate this with more recent scholarship, but what you're seeing here is what the Germans estimated are deployed on March 1st. And here, look at this large force that they don't know where they are. This is in the Odessa military district. Let's move up to the forces deployed against Army Group South, coming out of where the 6th Army was, towards Kiev over here. And here you see the estimates of this particular sector, the Kiev military district, and you see the deployment of Red Air Force regiments, bomber regiments. But look at this large amount that they do not know where they are. And here, these are signs of divisions of Red Air Force.
I was just going to ask you, what are those with the little bow ties? I don't remember.
These are air divisions.
Okay.
So they're estimating they don't know where 10 air divisions are. And here are the different components: bomber and fighter aircraft units, regiments that they do not have. And just referring to, this is the conflict. These are basically the symbols for bomber regiments. So you can see that most of what they can't figure out where it's deployed are bomber regiments in the Kiev military district. Now here is the Western District facing Army Group Center. And this map goes further back into Moscow. But again, this is what they're estimating on March 1st. And look at this large force. They were just talking about all these bomber formations coming out.
Yeah.
Look at all these bomber regiments that they do not know where they're deployed. Plus, they figure they can't estimate location of 6 Russian air divisions. And then they go further back to Moscow's military district, which obviously these troops were brought up, and then military district in Orel of significant amounts of troops. But this is quite interesting up here. Now, this is up facing Army Group North. And here you have again this is that airfield, by the way. I think I was showing that Craig was referring to when he was talking about the air operations of Air Fleet Number 1. But again, look at the contrast here between units that they don't know where they are. Here's the Baltic Military District. There's this large number of Red Air Force, both fighter regiments and bomber regiments. They don't know where they are. But then go further back. This is large concentrations in the Leningrad military district of almost 8 air divisions. And look at all the different fighter formations and bomber formations. They don't know where they are. So I just wanted to show that because, it's too bad Von Hardesty and Ilya aren't here. We can certainly get a picture from them when they show up. But let me start with...
that's going to be very interesting for them to explain that. It's nice to know more about it. Indeed.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Alex seems to be here in the name of Ted Cook. So anyway... Oh, Ellie, I see they're done.
Yeah, again, okay. Ted came over for a war game. But,
all right, so go on. So what's your question, Alex?
Hi, Alex.
I wanted to ask Craig, and thanks for a great talk, about the pre-battle reconnaissance from the Luftwaffe, like how how they organize. Obviously, we know that they kind of overflew, uh, freely the whole western part of Russia, and the Ukraine and the Baltics, and got a pretty good idea of obviously of what was on the ground, where the airfields were um, to strike on.
Right.
June 22nd. But yeah, I'm just curious about um, how they organized and kind of systematically did and recorded, I guess, intelligence wise.
Well,
Yeah.
they, I don't remember the name of the guy, Rossler or something. They had a special air unit of specially equipped, I think, Ju-88s and Heinkel 111s, which at those time in those days, those planes couldn't fly much above maybe, I don't know, 25,000 feet or so, but they had them outfitted to where they could fly at altitudes of, I think, as much as 35,000 feet, which was unheard of in those days. And get the engines, the oxygens that they needed. And they conducted hundreds, these and other aircraft, hundreds of reconnaissance flights with absolute impunity over Russian territory, mostly to a depth, I believe, of about 300 kilometers. The Germans, despite what they might not have known about a number of these Soviet air regiments or air divisions, they had a pretty good idea of the Soviet order of battle to a depth of about 300 kilometers, in part through these overflights, wireless, then typical wireless intercepts from ground units and so forth, because Soviet wireless discipline was notoriously bad. But after that, it was entirely a crapshoot. For example, they had literally no idea that the Russians were mobilizing a second echelon of 5 armies along the western Dvina and Dnieper rivers, about 500 kilometers behind the front. So yeah, they had some reasonably good information for the Soviet forces along the frontier, and after that they knew virtually nothing. And of course, Stalin and the Soviet High Command were completely aware of all these overflights, but as Stalin was concerned, he was just obsessed with not doing anything to provoke the Germans into attacking, to provoke Hitler's generals into launching an attack, maybe even without Hitler's knowledge. Because you see, Stalin had sent Hitler a letter. I don't remember exactly how we even learned of this. It wasn't until decades after the war that this became known. And I do not think this is apocryphal. I think it's really true. Stalin had sent the Fuhrer a letter I think in the spring of 41, asking him, dude, why are all these forces, you be building up all these forces along my border? And Hitler had actually written him back saying, well, it's all part of a deception campaign before we attack England. And the only person that Stalin seemed to be willing to want to believe was another dictator like himself. And so so he did. He just anyway. I'm losing my train of thought, but that was my point.
All right, go on, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Craig. I learned from that discussion. The one thing I have a problem with, though, was the Soviet bombing missions, which the Germans thought were infanticide. The one account I read about that was the Germans were, or at least this one German was very impressed with the fact that they maintained formation. In fact, for a bombing mission, you have to maintain formation. You can't be
Indeed.
maneuvering. So the Russians were doing it exactly right. And I don't understand. The Germans should have realized this in the Battle of Britain. They maintained formation too and got shot at. So this is a lesson they should have already known, particularly Kesselring.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. When you're conducting a bombing attack, whether it was the Soviet SB-2 bombers or B-17s over Germany, when you pass that initial point and you go into your bomb run, you have to stay steady and in flight. You can't take any evasive action. I think I actually thought of that when I said it, because you were right to criticize that point I made. I guess my point is that they kept doing it and kept doing it the same way without okay, we got to change our tactics. We got to come in from 8,000 feet, or we got to attack from a different direction. It was it reminds me of what happened to some of our B-52s in 1972 at the start of Operation Linebacker, when we were bombing Haiphong Harbor and Hanoi, whatever we were bombing up in the north. The first few missions we flew, we sent our bombers in from exactly the same approach, exactly as I understand it, exactly the same altitude. And I think on one day we actually lost 6 bombers, and that's when we realized, shit, we got to mix things up here. We got to approach from different angles, at different times, at different altitudes, to keep the enemy off balance. And just the fact that they kept doing this over and over again, I mean, it's extra. The bravery, the bravery of these men. I'm not saying they're stupid. I'm not. I was actually, I'm in awe of their bravery.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it shows me that since we've now started to really get into the details of the first day of the war, going forward, we can further explore the border battles in depth, while we go back and forth and bring in people with greater historical depth and periodization to look at this period of time. But we now can plunge into the fighting itself while we do it analytically. Does anybody else have any questions, comments? Or did he just overwhelm you?
I don't think it's that.
did he preempt you?
I have a second question.
Yeah, go on, Mark.
Thanks again, Greg. This was awesome.
Thanks.
You noted the concentration of the Stukas in the Central Army.
Yes.
And I was wondering, was the rest of the Luftwaffe somewhat similarly concentrated in Army Group Center? And if to the extent it was, why didn't Hitler pick up on that? Because there's that whole back and forth between Hitler and Halder about the emphasis of Barbarossa, whether it's going into Ukraine or towards Moscow. And it seems like did Hitler just not look into the details in this thing, or?
Well, he did, and there were arguments about that. For example, when the Germans, when Halder and the commander in chief of the army, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, initially briefed the Barbarossa campaign to Hitler, I think it was on the 5th of December, 1940. The Schwerpunkt, or the point of main effort, was agreed to by everyone to be with Army Group Center, because they figured that that's where the main Soviet forces were, which wasn't true, and they were in the south. And the principal operational goal was taking the city of Smolensk, which was like 700 kilometers beyond the frontier. but they clearly had the point of the area of concentration for both the air forces and the ground forces was with Army Group Center to encircle and destroy the mass of the Red Army west of the Western Dnieper, excuse me, the Western Dvina and the Dnieper rivers, which are about 500 kilometers from the frontier. But the thing is they didn't, if that, they left it open after that. They didn't determine, well, okay, if we don't succeed, if this initial attack doesn't succeed in destroying the Red Army, what are we going to do? Of course, Halder and Brauchitsch and the top German ground generals wanted to continue on toward Moscow because they thought that the Russians and the Red Army had to defend their capital, and as a result, they would be able to meet and destroy the bulk of the Red Army along the central axis. Hitler, on the other hand, he thought more in economic terms, and he wanted to turn the forces of Army Group Center, the motorized forces, north toward Leningrad and linking up with the Finns, and more importantly, south into the Ukraine, which of course was the breadbasket of Russia, and then into the Donbass or Donetsk region to capture its minerals. But they did not have a plan B to deal with the situation if the initial attack failed to destroy the Red Army and the Soviet state. With Halder kind of acting with a certain amount of subterfuge against Hitler, just thinking that, well, it doesn't matter that we haven't determined what we would do after the initial battles. The attack along the Central Front is going to be so powerful and so irresistible that we'll just sweep Hitler right along with us. And that's my key point, and he will allow us to maintain our momentum toward Moscow. But of course, as you pointed out, that's not what happened, because in July and August, they haggled over the next phase of the campaign for like a 6-week period. And then they stopped the advance on Moscow, and they sent the armor to the north and to the south.
I have a question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So, okay, we're talking about 3% loss as unacceptable. I understand that, but is that a function? First of all, what is an acceptable?
What is what?
Acceptable loss. 0.5%? I mean, what usually standard, is there a standard for this? Or is it a function of your own production, replacement? You know what I'm saying? So
that's a good point, and I don't know exactly how to answer that, but I will say, if you're losing 3% of your forces every day of a campaign, then that means within 10 days you've lost 30%.
No, that number is
those are unsustainable losses.
Well,
that, I mean, even with production, couldn't be made good.
So that's what I'm saying. So compared to what number, I understand 3 is horrible, but so what would have been an acceptable number? That's the question. Because there has to be some losses. You don't expect to.
Oh, of course. I don't know. Maybe 1%. I can't really answer that.
And what was the German industry doing at the time? I mean, what was their rate of replacement? How many planes were they building at the time?
German industry, in many respects, was still. I know this is hard to believe, but in many respects, it was still in sort of a peacetime mode. They weren't anywhere close to reaching their full production capability, and didn't even begin to do that until really after the disaster at Stalingrad, and they went to a total war effort. But I can't answer this for aircraft, but other than saying that the number of aircraft from June 40 to June 41 hardly increased at all, and they had 200 fewer bombers because they were losing more bombers in attrition than they were replacing. Look at tank production. The tank production hardly increased at all between June 1940 and June 1941. Now, they were producing some better tanks, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, but I think tank production only went up by maybe 50, 75 units a month, something like that. And when they attacked Russia, they literally only had 444, for some reason the number sticks in my head, 444 Panzer IV tanks for distribution across the entire Eastern Front. Again, it just gets back to that comment by Paul Johnson, the great British historian, in his I guess modern history of Europe, or whatever it's called, where he talks about the fact that Barbarossa was just fatally underpowered. The Germans just didn't have enough of anything, and the main reason for that was they just hadn't geared up for the war of attrition that they were going to end up fighting.
Gary? Gary, you have a comment?
Hi. Yeah. So thanks, Craig. Yeah, I appreciate your comments, especially you reiterated them just then about the sort of lack of mass of the Wehrmacht in general, but the Luftwaffe in particular. And I just want to counterbalance that against the sort of dominant narrative, you know, in the historiography, especially as it relates to the Western powers, you know, that there was this huge, big bad Luftwaffe sitting out there ready to just smash any Allied landings that came in the West or something. And you know, my position is that basically once they invaded the Soviet Union, they just it was already under strength then, and they never really made that good, and they were always going to be too divided. If you look at the fighter force, the German fighter force, during this whole period of time, all the way up through, you know, the end of May of 1944, going from, let's say, from Barbarossa up through that time, it never really varies. The Luftwaffe never put more than maybe 1,100 single-engine aircraft fighters in the air at any given time. You know, and the interesting thing is you talk about the best day for the Luftwaffe. I can tell you what the worst month for the Luftwaffe was, at least in terms of its fighter force, and it's not in the months prior to D-Day over Germany. It is July of 1943 on the Eastern Front. That's when they suffered their biggest losses in terms of, you know, percentage. That actually built up to the highest point of the entire war at the end of June, just prior to Kursk. They have their biggest losses percentage-wise, 17.5% in July of 1943. Wow. If you look at the cohort of the expert that had 60 or more victories, the biggest losses month by month in the entire war is July of 1943, and you know, give the Allies credit. It was 11 in that month. The next biggest month is 6 of the entire war, which was. Wait,
what do you mean it was 11%?
11. There's so there's there's about 220 some odd German fighter pilots that racked up 60 or more victories in their career. That's what
you're talking about.
Okay, so if you look at that cohort and you break down their losses, either killed in action or, you know, POW, which was not a lot of POWs, but and you break it down by month, the worst month of the war by far for that cohort is July of 1943 as well, and most of them were killed on the Eastern Front. And the second worst month of the war is about a five-way tie, but one of them was August of 1943, all of which were killed on the Eastern Front. So, we have this mythology that it was all, done by the P-51s over Germany and such, but yet there was a lot going on elsewhere. And the Luftwaffe was, but after they invaded the Soviet Union, they were never going to be that. They could be locally very superior, significant, because they could concentrate in areas where the Allies had difficulties, countering them, but they never really had the heft that we sort of imagined that they did after that, because they were just too dispersed and too not up to, numerically speaking, what was really required. And so I appreciate you making those comments. It went all the way back to the first day of Barbarossa.
Yeah. And Gary, you can say the same thing about the ground forces. By November of 1941, certainly with Army Group Center, the infantry companies, which had in their table of organization would have had maybe 180 men, were often down to 10, 15, 20 combat troops. And in his diary, Halder said it, I don't remember if it was late or early in November of 41, but he admitted that the German army will never be the same after the losses it has suffered in the first opening months of this Russian campaign. And of course, the same thing, as you say, is true of the German air forces, which had, I'd have to check the figures, but it seems like they had even more horrific losses in terms of numbers, and certainly by D-Day. And yeah, you're right. It was the Red Army, of which the Russian Air Force was a part, which broke the teeth of the German Wehrmacht, something like 75% of casualties on the Eastern Front. But obviously the air war over Germany with the P-51s and others did play a role in attriting German fighter aircraft. But between the result of both culminated in the 6th of June, 1944 in Normandy, whereas the Allies flew something over 10,000 sorties, the Germans only managed 319.
Fascinating. I'm looking through all these maps that Gary scanned for history. In the next, I'm going to pull some maps up. Does anybody else have some comments that they want to make?
Yeah, maybe we take one more. I gotta get something in my stomach. I'm starting to get a little dizzy here.
But
if someone else has another comment, I'll be delighted to respond.
Maybe Frank, you got.
Yeah, well, go on, Frank.
Can you hear me? I'm in a restaurant here.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I guess the comment is this: that from 1930, Stalin had been building up enormous forces relative to anybody else.
Yeah. And
as you mentioned, the German army had a lot of obsolete equipment in terms of tanks, like the Panzer I's, by the time they went into Russia, but nothing compared to what the Soviet Union had. The Soviet Union had Polikarpovs and out the wazoo. And in fact, the Russian Air Force, because of Khalkhin Gol, went into a mutiny. And Voroshilov had to prove that the Ki-2, I think it was inferior to the Polikarpov. And he did a test, and the wings fell off the Ki-2, and that proved it. And they understood that they shouldn't go into mutiny, so they didn't. And going into World War II, going into the Barbarossa, you've got a lot of junk on the ground in terms of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And had they flown, you would have had a lot of dead pilots.
Yeah.
So from the point of view of the Germans, they've lost probably at least 4,000 to 5,000 aircrew fighting against Poland, France, Britain, Crete, and the Mediterranean before they even went into the Soviet Union. This is nothing like what the Soviet Union had lost in Finland or against the Japanese. So actually, going into Barbarossa, the Russians were doing pretty well, because it would have been insane for them to go up with the junk they had on the ground. They were waiting for their MiGs and their LA-5s and whatever to come on board, plus the Lend-Lease that they were going to get. So this was also on the cards. Already the United States was talking about this. So actually, it's not stupid at all, as far from the Soviet Union point of view. Now, that doesn't mean that the first echelon people, the generals in charge of the first echelon of the Soviet army, were aware of this long-term stratagem. And so they were doing odd things, like sending whatever they had up, what they could get up. But again, Stalin had said, do not provoke. So any action by them at this stage was actually in contravention of what he wanted. So, what later happened, as you point out, in July and afterwards, that's the second echelon. That's the second echelon getting their act together. And I don't think it's appreciated just how many Soviet pilots had been trained to a modicum level compared to anybody else by this stage from 1930 onwards. And so I guess one question is, you mentioned Wenzel and the four-engine bomber. See, the only account I've seen of that is from David Irving, and his discussions apparently with Erhard Milch. That's a serious decision made by the Luftwaffe, not to have a four-engine bomber. Even the 177 isn't really a four-engine bomber. It's a two-propeller plane with four engines.
With four engines, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So it's like these are bizarre, extremely bizarre decisions. As is, in fact, the really bizarre decision to split off the Panzer groups around about August. That was the weirdest decision ever made, I think. But so yeah, I for one would like to know a little bit more about Wenzel and what happened to him, and it's all a little bit weird, the fact that they didn't have a four-engine bomber. That's my two cents.
You make some good points there, and particularly your point, as I pointed out, of the 1,811 planes, roughly, just exactly, but I kind of have a doubt in my mind that that's the actually real precise figure, but it's pretty close. The vast majority of them were destroyed on the ground, which means you didn't lose a pilot. And that pilot, as you imply, was much more important than the airplane. And the fact, ironically enough, in many ways, it probably helped the VVS that it got so few of its planes up into the air on the 22nd of June. Of course, I don't have my fingers in front of me now. Of course, by the 30th, they had lost, I don't know, over 4,000 aircraft or something. And I would have to think that at least a couple thousand of those were lost in the air. And we know they lost hundreds of bomber crews. But, and getting on to the other about the development or lack of development of the so-called Ural bomber, the heavy four-engine bomber that can, take a strategic air campaign to the enemy. Germans, as we saw, they didn't succeed in that. But you only a nation only has so many resources. nation has an industrial plant. You have so many people, so many factories, so many trained engineers and technicians, and so you have to make decisions about where those resources are going to go. In other words, do I want to build more tanks, or do I want to build more submarines, or do I want to build more aircraft or more battleships? I just you just made something flash into my mind that Walter K. Nering was a German tank commander, and in fact he commanded the 18th Panzer Division at the start of the Russian invasion, and went on to command an army or something on the Oder, if I recall, outside of in the spring of 1945, outside of Berlin. But he wrote a book about tank operations after World War II, and I'll never forget one thing that he wrote. He said he wrote, if we hadn't built the battleship Bismarck, he said, the steel that went into the battleship Bismarck could have produced 2,000 tanks. Now, I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that's still a pretty amazing thing to think about. And I don't want to get off track here, but the German industrial production, yes, it was somewhat rationalized when Speer came in, end of 42, whenever it was, and he turned out some pretty good numbers, but it was all so Byzantine, with people more concerned with protecting their own little empires than collaborating and working together to produce what needed to be produced. And then the Germans produced so many different types of so much equipment, whereas the Russians, they concentrated for the most part on a few types that worked, that were effective, like the T-34, and then just made incremental improvements to it instead of trying to come up with some Wunderwaffe, some wonder weapon to win the war. And obviously, if the Germans had taken a more rational approach to all of that, they probably would have had a much better equipped Wehrmacht than they eventually did.
All right, let me make some concluding comments here. It was raised earlier, the question of production. And this, of course, is a production table from Williamson Murray's History of the Luftwaffe. And as is well known, the issue of production in general and the shifting of resources domestically for consumption by the population in Germany as opposed to production for war was actually declining before Operation Barbarossa. Hitler was assuming he had early victory, and hence he was beginning to shift production before Barbarossa. So as you can see here, the amount of production of actual aircraft in 1940 as to 41, they're undertaking this amazing operation, which is based on the assumption will be over in a few months. And here you see how this breaks out in terms of actual production in 1941. Not much greater. What about 10,900 aircraft in 1940 produced, and then 11,800 produced in 1941. Now, what that does do is when the war extends, and this is another table from Wick's History of the Luftwaffe, which is, I recommend you can get it for free. It was done by the Department of the Air Force. You can see the actual readiness rates of the various squadrons and how they start to decline because they don't have production up, plus the training pipeline is declined, etc. And you see that by December of 1941, their readiness rates are down to 63%.
Yeah.
The bomber rates are down to 47%. Now, another question that was raised earlier that Frank raised was Lend-Lease. Now, Lend-Lease is quite controversial. And I'll just simply show something from Wikipedia because that's something I'm going to handle down the road. The issue of whether Lend-Lease, pre-Lend-Lease, what occurred, the question of them waiting for American aircraft, interesting question. But as we can see, we know that when President Roosevelt dispatches Harry Hopkins to Moscow, this is before the signing of the Agencia Treaty, the whole Atlantic Charter and all that in the summer of 1941. What we do see is that the amount of actual aid that goes to the Soviet Union is actually quite small for 1941. So, so that's another question to further explore as we go into this. But in any event, I don't want to hold Craig from getting his sugar influx. So I want to thank Craig so much for giving us a great introduction to this and a very rich one. And I want to thank him so much for coming today and everybody else for participating. Thank you guys so much. And
yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for hanging out for 3 hours.